the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. The Manual for Treasure Seekers, a segment where we get into the do's and don'ts of finding hidden treasure in books. Part 2. The Treasure of Abbot Thomas by M.R. James. Mr. Montague Rhodes James was a medievalist scholar and provost of both King's College and Eton College. His stories have a strong foundation in historical research, with an element of truth at their core, making their plots almost believable. My high school fencing instructor at St. Louis de Montfort Academy, Mr. Rourke Mitchell, was enchanted with the writing style of M.R. James. It was so very different from the goth style of writing ghost tales that was so prominent during the Victorian era. He told me that Professor James would attempt to teach history class to his students, but they would keep begging him to tell one of his historical ghost stories during class. I don't know how M.R. James got such a reputation for spinning yarns, but I do know that he made a deal with his students. If they had good marks on their tests, he would oblige them in making up a sufficiently chilling tale. He never had any intention of publishing these fictional digressions until his students forced his hand to write them down, and that's how we have his books today. I don't know where Mr. Mitchell heard this because I haven't been able to find it anywhere, but I find it very charming and quaint that a history professor would make up stories to entertain his students, and that's what I think ghost stories are, just a charming way to pass the time. The horror genres of today are bordering on the satanic, and they have nothing on M.R. James. The main characters of his tales are often archaeologists or antiquaries. This was fitting for M.R. James, because in 1902, he himself discovered a manuscript fragment which led to excavations in the ruins of the abbey at Bury St Edmunds, in which the graves of several 12th-century abbots were rediscovered, having been lost since the dissolution of the monasteries. He also catalogued many of the manuscript libraries of the University of Cambridge and translated the Book of Baruch from its original Ethiopic in 1879. Being such an authority in the experiences of historical research puts him in a league all of his own when it comes to ghost stories, and you feel as if you can just reach out and touch the characters of his gripping plots. Obviously, I don't recommend everything he wrote, as it can sometimes be a bit dark, but this tale out of all of them is undoubtedly one of his best, and is my personal favorite. I give you The Treasure of Abbot Thomas. Verum usque in presentum diem multa geriunt inter se canonici de abscondito, quorum istius abbatis Thomae thesauro, quam sepe, quamquam aduc in casum, quasi verunt Steinfeldenses. Ipsum enum Thomam... Mr. Somerton's voice trailed off, and he smiled at the bewildered face of his loyal manservant, Mr. William Brown. I suppose I shall have to translate this for you? Yes, sir, if you please, sir, replied Brown, who was all ears at the prospect of a mystery. Mr. Somerton had just finished copying the above lines from that rather rare and exceedingly diffuse book, the Certum Steinfeldense Norbertinum. This is a real book, I actually looked it up. It's an account of the Premonstratensian Abbey of Steinfeld in the Eifel, with lives of the abbots, published at Cologne in 1712 by Christian Albert Arhard, a resident in the district. The epithet Norbertinum is due to the fact that St. Norbert was the founder of the order. Translated, it read, "Up to the present day, there is much gossip among the canons about a certain hidden treasure of this Abbot Thomas, for which those of Steinfeld have often made search, though hitherto in vain. The story is that Thomas, while yet in the vigor of life, concealed a very large quantity of gold somewhere in the monastery. He was often asked where it was, and always answered, with a laugh, 'Job, John, and Zechariah will tell either you or your successors.' He sometimes added that he should feel no grudge against those who might find it. Among other works carried out by this abbot, I may specially mention his filling the great window at the east end of the south aisle of the church with figures admirably painted on glass, as his effigy and arms in the window attest. He also restored almost the whole of the abbot's lodging and dug a well in the court of it, which he adorned with beautiful carvings in marble. He died rather suddenly in the 72nd year of his age, in the year of our Lord 1529. The object which Mr. Somerton had before him at the moment was that of tracing the whereabouts of the painted windows of the Abbey Church of Steinfeld. Shortly after the Revolution, a very large quantity of painted glass made its way from the dissolved abbeys of Germany and Belgium to this country, and may now be seen adorning various of our parish churches, cathedrals, and private chapels. The passage with which I began my story had set Mr. Somerton on the track of another identification. In a private chapel owned by someone who Mr. Somerton simply referred to as Lord D, he had seen 3 large figures, each occupying a whole light in a window, and evidently the work of one artist. Their style made it plain that that artist had been a German of the 16th century. They represented Job Patriarcha, Johannes Evangelista, and Zacharias Propheta. Each of them held a book or scroll inscribed with a sentence from his writings. These, as a matter of course, the antiquary had noted, and had been struck by the curious way in which they differed from any text of the Vulgate that he had been able to examine. Thus the scroll in Job's hand was inscribed, Auro est locus in quo absconditur. There is a place for the gold where it is hidden. On the Book of John was, Abent investimentis suis scripturam quam nemo novit, and Zacharias had, Super lapidem unum septem oculi sunt. Upon one stone are 7 eyes. It was a strange thing that these 3 personages should have been placed together in one window. There was no bond of connection between them, either historic, symbolic, or doctrinal, and he could only suppose that they must have formed part of a very large series of prophets and apostles, which might have filled, say, all the windows of some capacious church. Mr. Somerton set out on pilgrimage to the private chapel with very little delay, and his conjecture was confirmed to the full. Not only did the style and technique of the glass suit perfectly with the date and place required, but in another window of the chapel he found some glass known to have been bought along with the figures, which contained the arms of Abbot Thomas von Eschenhausen. Upon this discovery, Mr. Somerton's mind was haunted with one question. Might the curiously selected texts on the scrolls in the window be a reference to the hidden treasure of Abbot Thomas? And here I'm just going to summarize what happens next for our listeners. Mr. Somerton painstakingly examines the stained glass window, looking carefully for any writing on the 3 figures' clothes. For as the legend on the Book of John read, they have on their vestures a writing which no man knoweth. But there isn't any trace of writing on their clothes at all. Lord D suddenly enters and sees that Somerton's hands are black from touching the dirty stained glass window. He orders one of his servants to clean it, which exposes some gold lettering beneath the black border on one of the saint's robes. Somerton finds that the rest of the black border can be scraped away easily and obtains Lord D's permission to remove it. He notes down the seemingly meaningless jumble of letters, knowing in his heart that this must be the code that holds the secret location of the treasure. Just as an aside, I really enjoy the fact that M.R. James doesn't explain what this Lord D is like or where his chapel is located, as if he were a real man with treasures to protect and privacy to be respected. Is he a hardened, cruel old baron who's on to Somerton's game, or is he a muddle-brained upper-class fop who carelessly spends his inheritance with little regard for his ancestral history? We don't know, and it's all left entirely to our imagination. But back to Mr. Somerton and his discovery of the code in the stained glass window. Every feature or mark which could possibly assist in elucidating the riddle was noted with scrupulous care, and, returning to his Berkshire manor house, Mr. Somerton consumed many a pint of the midnight oil over his tracings and sketches. Upon several unsuccessful attempts to crack the code, he could have cried from sheer disappointment at his predicament, for, as he said later, the codes were only the most hopeless jumble of letters that was ever shaken up in a hat. Just to give an idea, Job's mantle alone contained 38 letters, which, when put together, made no sense whatsoever in any language. These attempts at code-breaking continued for some time until Mr. Somerton referred back to his notes. One paragraph read, Job, scroll in left hand, forefinger of right hand extended upwards. John, holds inscribed book in left hand, with right hand, blesses with 2 fingers. Zechariah, scroll in left hand extended upwards with 3 fingers pointing up. In other words, Job has 1 finger extended, John has 2, Zechariah has 3. a gasp of amazement. Could this mean that after the first letter in the message, he should skip one letter, then skip two, and after that should skip three? Upon his first try at this method, he sprang up from the table in amazement, as though the ghostly abbot himself had appeared to him to whisper these words. It read in Latin, Rio domus abbatialis de Steinfeld a me, Toma qui posui custodem super ea. 10,000 pieces of gold are laid up in the well in the court of the abbot's house of Steinfeld by me, Thomas, who have set a guardian over them. And below this Latin sentence was a warning in Old French, Gare à qui la touche, whoever touches them, beware. After 2 or 3 weeks since he noted down the riddle, the day came when Mr. Somerton announced to his man, Mr. Brown, that he must pack his own and his master's things for a short journey abroad to the village of Steinfeld, whither for the moment we will not follow them. This is a letter written some days later to a Mr. Gregory, the rector of Parsbury, and a very good friend of Mr. Somerton. With many misspellings, it read, Honoured Sir, as I am in great anxiety about Master, I write to beg you, sir, if you could be so good as to step over. Master has had a nasty shock, and keeps his bed. I never have known him like this, but no wonder and nothing will serve but you, sir. Master says what I mention the short way here is to drive to Cobblence and take a trap. Hoping I have made all plain, but am much confused in myself what with anxiety and wakefulness at night. If I might be so bold, sir, it will be a pleasure to see a honest British face among all these foreign ones. I am, sir, your obedient servant, William Brown. P.S. The village name is Steinfeld. It would seem that Somerton needed Mr. Gregory desperately, and he left without delay to Steinfeld, finding his friend lying helplessly in bed. He was in a most piteous state, and said that the next day he would tell all, as long as Gregory would do some certain seemingly odd tasks for him. The next day the tasks were done, and Mr. Somerton, after many a glass of fortifying cognac, finally told his strange winding tale, which we will pick up at the best part, setting out in the dead of night to search for buried treasure. Well, my dear Gregory, I was well prepared. Knowing the sort of place I should have to explore, I had brought a sufficiency of good rope and bands of webbing to surround my body and crossbars to hold to, as well as lanterns and candles and crowbars, all of which would go into a single carpet bag and excite no suspicion. I satisfied myself that my rope would be long enough and that the wheel for the bucket was in good working order, and then we went home to dinner. I had a little cautious conversation with the landlord, and made out that he would not be overmuch surprised if I went out for a stroll with my man at about 11 o'clock, to make, heaven forgive me, a sketch of the abbey by moonlight. I asked no questions about the well, and am not likely to do so now. I fancy I know as much about it as anyone in Steinfeld. At least, with a strong shudder, I don't want to know any more. Now we come to the crisis, and though I hate to think of it, I feel sure, Gregory, that it will be better for me in all ways to recall it just as it happened. We started, Brown and I, at about 11 with our bag. In 5 minutes we were at the well, and for some little time we sat on the edge of the wellhead to make sure that no one was stirring or spying on us. All we heard was some horses cropping grass out of sight farther down the eastern slope. We were perfectly unobserved, and had plenty of light from the gorgeous full moon to allow us to get the rope properly fitted over the well. Then I secured the band round my body beneath the arms. We attached the end of the rope very securely to a ring in the stonework. Brown took the lighted lantern and followed me. I had a crowbar, and so we began to descend cautiously, feeling every step before we set foot in it, and scanning the walls in search of any marked stone. Half aloud I counted the steps as we went down, and we got as far as 38 before I noted anything at all irregular on the surface of the masonry. Even here there was no mark, and I began to feel very blank, and to wonder if the abbot's cryptogram could possibly be an elaborate hoax. At the 49th step, the staircase ceased. It was with a very sinking heart that I began retracing my steps, and when I was back on the 38th, Brown with the lantern being a step or two above me, I scrutinized the little bit of irregularity in the stonework with all my might, but there was no vestige of a mark. Then it struck me that the texture of the surface looked just a little smoother than the rest, or at least in some way different. It might possibly be cement and not stone. I gave it a good blow with my iron bar. There was a decidedly hollow sound, though that might be the result of our being in a well. But there was more. A great flake of cement dropped onto my feet, and I saw marks on the stone underneath. I had tracked the abbot down, my dear Gregory. Even now I think of it with a certain pride. It took but a very few more taps to clear the whole of the cement away, and I saw a slab of stone about 2 feet square, upon which was engraven a cross. Disappointment again, but only for a moment, for it was you, Brown, who reassured me by a casual remark. You said, if I remember right, "It's a funny cross, looks like a lot of eyes." I snatched the lantern out of your hand and saw with inexpressible pleasure that the cross was composed of 7 eyes, 4 in a vertical line, 3 horizontal. The last of the scrolls in the window was explained in the way I had anticipated. Here was my stone with the 7 eyes. So far the abbot's data had been exact, and as I thought of this, the anxiety about the guardian returned upon me with increased force. Still, I wasn't going to retreat now. Without giving myself time to think, I knocked away the cement all round the marked stone, and then gave it a pry on the right side with my crowbar. It moved at once, and I saw that it was but a thin, light slab, such as I could easily lift out myself, and that it stopped the entrance to a cavity. I did lift it out unbroken, and set it on the step, for it might be very important to us to be able to replace it. Then I waited several minutes on the step just above. I don't know why, but I think to see if any dreadful thing would rush out. Nothing happened. Next I lit a candle, and very cautiously I placed it inside the cavity, with some idea of seeing whether there were a foul air and of getting a glimpse of what was inside. There was some foulness of air, which nearly extinguished the flame, but in no long time it burned quite steadily. The hole went some little way back, and also on the right and left of the entrance, and I could see some rounded light-colored objects within which might be bags. There was no use in waiting. I faced the cavity and looked in. There was nothing immediately in front of the hole. I put my arm in and felt to the right very gingerly. Just give me a glass of cognac, Brown. I'll go on in a moment, Gregory. Well, I felt to the right, and my fingers touched something very curved that felt more or less like leather. Dampish it was, and evidently part of a heavy, full thing. There was nothing, I must say, to alarm one. I grew bolder, and putting both hands in as well as I could, I pulled it to me, and it came. It was heavy, but moved more easily than I'd expected. As I pulled it towards the entrance, my left elbow knocked over and extinguished the candle. I got the thing fairly in front of the mouth and began drawing it out. Just then, Brown gave a sharp ejaculation and ran quickly up the steps with the lantern. Startled as I was, I looked round after him and then back to the thing, for I could have sworn I saw it move. And I was right. It hung for an instant on the edge of the hole, then slipped forward onto my chest and put its arms around my neck. My dear Gregory, I'm telling you the exact truth. I believe I am now acquainted with the extremity of terror and repulsion which a man can endure without losing his mind. I can only just manage to tell you now the bare outline of the experience. I was conscious of a most horrible smell of mold, and of a cold kind of face pressed against my own, and moving slowly over it, and of slimy arms and legs clinging to my body. I screamed out, and Brown says it was like a beast. I fell away backwards from the step on which I stood, and the creature slipped downwards, I suppose onto that same step. Providentially, the band round me held firm. Brown did not lose his head, and was strong enough to pull me up to the top and get me over the edge quite promptly. How he managed it exactly I don't know, and I think even he would find it hard to tell you. I'm not certain, but I believe he contrived to hide our implements in the deserted building nearby, and with very great difficulty he got me back to the inn. I was in no state to make explanations, and Brown knows no German, but next morning I told the people some tale of having had a bad fall in the abbey ruins, which I suppose they believed. There was the smell, The hideous smell of mold. Every rag I had on me on that first evening I had stripped off and made Brown take it away. I believe he stuffed the things into the stove in his room, and yet the smell was there, as intense as it had been in the well. And what is more, it came from outside the door. But with the first glimmer of dawn it faded out, and the sounds ceased too, and that convinced me that the thing or things were creatures of darkness, and could not stand the daylight, and so I was sure that if anyone could put back the stone, it or they would be powerless until someone else took it away again. I had to wait until you came to get that done. Of course I couldn't send Brown to do it by himself, and still less could I tell anyone who belonged to the place. Well, my dear Gregory, there's my story, and if you don't believe it, I can't help it. But I think you do, all the same. Indeed, said Mr. Gregory, I can find no alternative. I must believe it. I saw the well in the stone myself, and had a glimpse, I thought, of the bags or something else in the hole. And to be plain with you, Somerton, I believe my door was watched last night, too. I dare say it was, Gregory, but thank goodness that's over. Have you, by the way, anything to tell about your visit to that dreadful place? Very little, was the answer. Brown and I managed easily enough to get the slab into its place, and he fixed it very firmly with the irons and wedges you had desired him to get, and we contrived to smear the surface with mud so that it looks just like the rest of the wall. One thing I did notice in the carving on the wellhead, which I think must have escaped you, was a horrid grotesque shape, perhaps more like a toad than anything else, and there was a label by it inscribed with the two words, Depositum Custodii. Keep that which is committed to thee. The end of The Treasure of Abbot Thomas by M.R. James. So what's the takeaway from this story? It is, after all, part of my manual for treasure seekers. Well, if you meet a monk that brags about a treasure of ill-gotten gains he's hidden somewhere and laughs maniacally every time you ask him about it, the chances are the treasure's cursed. Monks take a vow of poverty, so why on earth didn't he just give it to the poor? I've heard of a former monk leaving a monastery because he was attached to the lock on his door, and he would transfer it every time he changed rooms. Getting attached to a doorknob is one thing, but an entire treasure from your less holier days? That's a big attachment to send a man to hell. The monk probably brought the secret to his grave, and the angels wept over it ever since. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe the Abbot Thomas saw how greed corrupts the hearts of men, and he wanted to give his treasure back to the devil. It could be either of those hypotheses. But as for the giant toad guarding the treasure, I seem to remember a devil in the dreams of St. John Bosco that was very similar. As for me, there's no way I would touch that treasure with a 10-foot pole. I'd be better off going into the stock market. No, I don't believe everything in this story is true, or that M.R. James even fully thought out the spiritual aspects of this story, even though I think that the existence of the treasure was historically correct, but I honestly enjoyed the creative style and captivating way he wrote it, and I think you might too. We'll certainly be seeing more of Mr. Montague Rhodes James on this podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and Godspeed.